And my privilege to be with you all today to discuss this encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. As Mr. Fulkerson said, a lot of people have written off this encyclical as being unimportant. Some claim that there's not much new in it, that it's little more than a stale repetition of the things that His Holiness has said again and again throughout his papacy. And I have to agree that it is in fact more than a little repetitious, but I strongly disagree that it is unimportant because of this. Rather, I believe it is among the most important documents of his entire papacy thus far. And that is because it synthesizes much of the erroneous doctrines that he holds, and even more importantly, it gives a glimpse at what the future will look like if his teachings are carried out to their final consequences. And that's why it's imperative that we all understand the problems with this document and how to present the true Catholic teaching that is opposed to the errors that it contains. In fact, we have to become enthralled with the church teachings and learn to communicate our enthusiasm over them to others. And most of the world would never admit this, but in reality, the Catholic Church is the center of history. There's never been a more potent force in forming the lives of men, spurring them to action, and thus dictating the course of world events than the Catholic Church. Thank you, Mr. Galatolo. And because of that, there is no organization that is as capable of dictating where things will go into the future. The Catholic Church is that mover, that primary mover of world history. So during our times, as we look at this, there are primarily two visions that are increasingly facing off within the Catholic Church. One is true, and the other one is false. And the true one states that the solution to the current crises that we are facing, that's too numerous for us to mention all of them here, is to return to the age-old teachings that were revealed by our Lord and which the Church has taught for 2,000 years. These faithful base themselves on these teachings as they seek for answers to the current crises that we are facing. Now, please note, this true solution does not mean returning to a primitive or an outdated way of life. This correct solution lies in adhering to a proper notion of tradition, whereby the future is the harmonious continuation of the past, guided by the accumulated wisdom of those who came before us. So in other words, as we march forward towards an unknown future, we realize that the solutions to future problems that we can't even predict yet will always be found by adhering to and developing further the unchangeable, infallible truths that the Holy Ghost has left us within the Catholic Church as our patrimony. Is that clear? Okay, so that's very much one side, and that's the good side. And there is a book that lays out clearly and concisely how this can happen. How it is that we can march ahead towards a future that will be the realization of a true Christian civilization the way it should exist in the 21st century and beyond. And please forgive me for the shameless pitch I'm about to make for one of our own books, but honestly, this book, Return to Order, is the best book I know of. It's the only book that I know of that really takes upon itself the task of solving our current societal problems. And it gives us a sufficient solution to them as well. So that is the true vision of the way we should advance towards the future. The false vision says exactly the opposite. It claims that the Catholic Church is an outdated institution, that its doctrines are narrow-minded and its morality is childishly prudish. This vision desires to break with these infallible truths of faith and Catholic moral teaching in order to remake the Church under a new image that is compatible with the immoral and irrational fancies of the modern world. Unfortunately, with the Second Vatican Council, this erroneous vision took on an official air and gained frightful momentum. And indeed, the very reason given for the council was to open the Church to modernity. That's what Pope John the 23rd meant when he opened the council and referred to opening the windows of the Church to let the fresh air of the modern world in. Now, Pope Francis has left little doubt where he stands in face of this issue. of tradition versus modernity. He went so far as to affirm that the goal of his papacy is to bring to fruition the changes that were initiated in the Second Vatican Council. In one of his infamous interviews with Eugenio Scalfari, he affirmed this, saying, quote, "I will not have much time to finish the work to which I must dedicate myself, which is the fulfillment of the goals prescribed by the Second Vatican Council, and particularly of having the Church meet with modernity," close quote. So this is the false vision of how to deal with the crisis of the modern world. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like a document that lays out clearly how this can happen, in other words, how the world can march towards the future in which the church has fundamentally changed, if you want to see how the church can be transformed into an institution that no longer holds back the revolutionary tide that's engulfing the world, but rather unites itself with that crisis and promotes it, I can suggest nothing better than Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti. As you can see, this is the copy that I studied, and there are one or two red marks that I made on it. There are a couple of things in it that I didn't quite agree entirely with. But there it is. I'm sorry to put things in such blunt terms, but I place these two works very much against each other. And I believe a thorough study of both can indicate clearly the two sides of an immense ideological battle that is currently raging throughout the church and the world, and the outcome of this battle that's taking place will decide the course that history will take for the future centuries. So with that introduction, we'll begin to address the contents of this document and get into the meat of our talk today. First of all, Fratelli Tutti is an encyclical. And an encyclical, as we all know, is a letter that the Pope sends to all the bishops of the world to guide them in the fulfillment of their duty. So Fratelli Tutti is a letter, and it's 74 pages long. Has anyone here ever received a letter that's 74 pages long before? As you can imagine, it's intended to be more than just a directive letter. In fact, it is meant to be a manifesto, and that's a much better description of what Fratelli Tutti is. It's a manifesto about the principles of universal brotherhood, the unity that should be forged amongst all people. Not only is it 74 pages, but there are so many problems with it. If I were to address all of them, my talk would literally last forever. You all wouldn't like me anymore, and I would never be invited here again. And I certainly don't want that to happen. So to avoid that, I'm going to be forced to greatly summarize my objections to this document, even though this talk will be a little bit longer perhaps than ones you're used to attending here. So for the first half of my talk, I'm not even going to mention the encyclical. Rather, I'm going to discuss what I believe to be the foundational error upon which most of the problems inside the document are based. And we'll discuss the Catholic truth opposed to this error, and then we can look at direct passages from each chapter of the encyclical and see how all of this applies. So by spending some time away from the document, we'll have a more concise way of addressing the document as a whole. And I hope that's clear. So what is this error that I believe is most responsible for the problems in this encyclical? It is a false notion of human dignity. Pope Francis repeatedly affirms that all mankind can be united merely upon the dignity that all men possess, merely by the fact that they are human. This unity, he says, can exist between people of all religions, all sinners, and all saints. It can even exist between society and those who have committed crimes heinous enough to merit the death penalty, although he denies that this and even life imprisonment can ever be justified. But we'll get more into that later. So this is fundamentally flawed because in spite of the fact that we share human dignity, there also exists truth and error. There's goodness and evil, and unity that is not forged around truth and goodness will never endure for a long period of time. And this may seem obvious, but to substantiate it, we can turn to the book of Genesis. Directly after the fall, God scolded Adam and Eve and then cursed the devil. We all know this. While doing so, God prophesied that throughout all of history, there would be irreconcilable differences between those who are good and those who are evil. And the fight between the two would continue until Our Lady definitively destroys evil at the end of the world. And this is recorded in Genesis, chapter 3, verse 15, when God says this to the serpent, quote, "I will put enmities between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed. She shall crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for her heel." So analyzing this passage, the great St. Louis de Montfort tells us that God placed an enmity between the devil and the woman. An enmity is an irreconcilable difference. Where there's an enmity, full union is never possible. Who do you suppose that woman that God was talking about was? Well, at that time, the devil only knew of the existence of two women. He knew that Eve existed because he had tempted her, and she had just given in to him, so there was no enmity there. The other woman he knew would exist was the Blessed Virgin. And when he found out about the existence of the coming of the Blessed Virgin, that's what sparked him to revolt. So we know that the woman being spoken of here, is the Blessed Virgin. So there can never be unity between Our Lady and the devil. However, God extends this, and he says he also places an enmity between the seed of the devil and Our Lady's seed. In other words, the spiritual followers of each. Thus, history is made up by the conflict between good and evil that will culminate when the head of the devil is definitively crushed by Our Lady at the end of the world. So this enmity that God placed holds true in spite of the fact that all men possess dignity as human beings. Pope Francis denies the existence of this enmity, and the mechanism he uses to do so is an exaggerated notion of human dignity. Now, for a long time, this tool has been used to promote progressive causes within the church, this false notion of human dignity. So before we get into the false notion, we have to familiarize ourselves with the true concept of human dignity. What does human dignity mean? We have to understand exactly what the church teaches about this. And after we do so, its abuse will become abundantly clear. So let's start with the meaning of the word dignity. If we look in the dictionary, we see the word dignity means the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect. So someone possesses dignity when they are worthy to receive honor or respect. Now, because all men are created in the image and likeness of God, every man has an intrinsic dignity. In other words, because man possesses a similarity with God, it is proper that he be given a certain degree of honor and respect. The part of us that is made in the image of God is our souls, because like God, our souls possess free will and the ability to reason. So in all of material creation, man alone has these faculties. He can reason and he has a free will. Therefore, man possesses a greater dignity than any other earthly creature. Pretty obvious. Now, I don't want to get into it now because it would be a distraction, but even someone who is so handicapped that he is unable to reason or choose freely still has this image of God because his soul is capable of reason and free will. He may have physical defects that prevent him from using these faculties partially or entirely, but his soul is not defective. Souls are created directly by God and cannot be defective. Therefore, he still possesses this human dignity that we're discussing. Now, because this fundamental dignity, being created in the image and likeness of God, is shared by all men, and every man has because of that, every man has certain unalienable rights, which cannot be denied to him unless he forfeits them by his own choice or by his behavior. Furthermore, these rights stem from the fact that man is made in God's image and likeness. And therefore, every man has an equal right to these rights, or he possesses them to an equal degree. And we're familiar with these rights. They include the right to life, ownership of property, freedom of movement from one place to another. In other words, you can't unjustly imprison someone. They also include the right to constitute a family or to choose not to constitute a family. Now, as I said, all men are equal in those rights that are derived from his intrinsic dignity. So all men have an equal right to life. That's why you can't kill one man to save another, regardless of their status. For example, you could never remove the heart from a peasant to put it in the chest of a king to save his life. If you did that, you'd commit murder, because the peasant and the king have an equal right to life. Is that clear? Yes. Wonderful. However, there's a lot more to human dignity than just this concept of man's intrinsic dignity. Because man has the capacity to use his free will to become more like God or less like God. And when he does so, he increases the image of God in himself, therefore increasing his dignity, or he decreases God's image in his soul and decreases his dignity. Now you can see that this is a slightly different kind of dignity, but it is also a perfectly legitimate meaning of the word dignity. And in fact, this is the meaning of dignity that is much more commonly used when we speak about dignity in day-to-day language. Author Fred Goyette was referring to St. Thomas Aquinas' notion of this type of dignity in his essay titled St. Thomas Aquinas and Recent Questions About Human Dignity, when he said this, quote, "This dignity is dynamic. That is, it can develop and become stronger when we exercise the gifts of faith, hope, and love, or it can become weaker when we sin and turn away from God," close quote. Now, when we increase our dignity by the practice of virtue, that means that others have the obligation to treat us with more honor and respect, even though this doesn't alter the degree to which we possess those inalienable rights that we have. So a war hero has the same right to life as a coward, but justice demands that society honor the war hero more than the coward. It is even fitting that society give him special privileges that are not extended to the coward because he has increased his dignity. And that can take whatever form, tax breaks, whatever. It's very, very proper that society has these. Similarly, a practicing Catholic, just by the fact that he's worshiping God in the manner that God has revealed he wants to be worshipped, has strengthened God's image in his soul, and thus possesses greater dignity than someone who is practicing a false religion or no religion at all. Now remember, dignity is the quality of deserving honor. St. Thomas Aquinas affirms that not everyone is equal in the honor that they deserve from society. He argues, interestingly, that not just the practice of virtue increases the honor that one should receive, but also one's role in society may place them in a situation in which they represent God to a greater or lesser degree and therefore merit more or less honor. So this is the way St. Thomas explains it, and it's very beautiful. He says, quote, "To honor a person is to recognize him as having virtue. Wherefore virtue alone is the due cause of a person being honored. Now it is to be observed that a person may be honored not only for his own virtue, but also for someone else's virtue. Thus princes and prelates, although they be wicked, are honored as standing in God's place and as representing the community over which they are placed. And in the same way, parents and masters should be honored on account of their having a share in the dignity of God, who is the Father and Lord of all. The aged also should be honored, because old age is a sign of virtue, although often this sign fails. The rich ought to be honored by reason of their occupying a higher position in the community. However, if they be honored merely for their wealth, it would be the sin of respect of persons," close quote. Just out of curiosity, has anyone here ever heard that St. Thomas Aquinas teaches that the rich ought to be honored in society? You have before?
Yes.
Okay. We've got a convinced Thomist here. It's good to have someone in the front row that can back me up like that. Yes, he does. But you certainly haven't heard that from the present pontiff, I can guarantee you. Now, I know this notion may seem strange to our modern ears, so just getting into it a little bit. Obviously, St. Thomas is not talking about the nouveau riche, people that flaunt their wealth, movie stars. He's not speaking of unjust business practices. He's not speaking of denigrating the poor in any way. Rather, he's just pointing out that someone who possesses more is more similar to God, who possesses all things. Therefore, that similarity with God deserves a certain honor. And furthermore, the more possessions someone has, the more they stand in a position in which they have the capacity to help all of society. They can be greater benefactors to society if they follow God's will. Thus, they merit a special honor. Is that clear? Very, very interesting. So some possess more dignities than others and should occupy higher places in society. However, this works both ways. St. Thomas argues that man can diminish his dignity through sin to such an extent that he becomes like an animal and forfeits his inalienable rights, even the right to life. That's why in the Summa we find this passage, quote, "By sinning, man departs from the order of reason and consequently falls away from the dignity of his manhood, insofar that he is naturally free and exists for himself, and he falls into the slavish state of a beast. Hence, although it be evil in itself to kill a man so long as he preserve his dignity, yet it may be good to kill a man who has sinned, even as it is to kill a beast. For a bad man is worse than a beast and is more harmful, as the philosopher states." Close quote. Now, before anyone gets the wrong idea here, St. Thomas is quick afterwards to point out that only the state and not the individual is permitted to execute a sinner. But he reaffirms that right that society has. Death penalty, absolutely. Anyway, I hope with all this we're starting to see that the issue of human dignity is complex. A good way to summarize what we have seen is to look upon human dignity in two different ways. The first way is to consider it in what I will call its base state. This is the dignity that every man possesses simply because he is a creature made in the image and likeness of God. And this cannot be lost, because to lose it, one would have to cease to be human. This is the dignity that all men share simply because we all share human nature. Now, from this perspective, men have the same dignity and therefore must be given the same rights that this base degree of dignity demands. So that's one understanding of dignity. However, in addition to this intrinsic dignity, there is another type of dignity that man can increase or decrease by his acceptance or rejection of virtue. And men possess this kind of dignity to greatly different degrees and must be treated differently to reflect this reality. So we always, when we're talking about dignity, we have to consider both of these aspects of human dignity. Because if we leave one of them out, we will fall into one of two very grave errors. So you see, if we muddle this notion, this clear philosophical notion of dignity, we will lead to problems because bad philosophy always leads to bad action. So, for example, if we were to deny the first definition of human dignity, the kind that leads us to our rights, deny that we all share in the dignity of being creatures of God and made in his image and likeness, it can justify all manner of evils. He could decide that one group or class possesses its inalienable rights more than another one, and therefore it could deny these rights to certain sectors of the public for the benefit of others. And this could lead to slavery, eugenics, genocide. I mean, isn't that basically what the Nazis did? They considered that Catholics and Jews were not entirely human, so their property could be taken away, they could be prevented from establishing a family, and even they could be rounded up and slaughtered. They had the second notion. Some could be honored more than others, but they were lacking the first notion that there's equal rights we have as being all possessing of human dignity. Now, that's pretty clear. However, what happens if you accept the first notion of dignity, the kind of dignity that all men share, but deny the second notion of dignity, that by our behavior or our position in society, we are all given greater or lesser honor? If we do this, we end up with Fratelli Tutti, in which Pope Francis affirms that every man, regardless of his beliefs, his lifestyle, or crimes, possesses equal dignity. He further attests that these beliefs and lifestyle, even if they are sinful, must be accepted and respected. Why? Because pagans and sinners are equal in their dignity to everyone else. This false notion of dignity did not begin with Pope Francis. It's very present in the teachings on modernism, which St. Pius X condemned over 100 years ago. And in fact, I originally planned to make a whole section of this talk about how the false notion of dignity is present in modernism. But when I got to this point, I realized that I was almost a third finished with my talk, and I hadn't even quoted a single passage from Fratelli Tutti yet. So I thought, let's back it off. Just want to throw that out there. This notion is present in modernism. But it was more clearly defined and expressed in this document, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. This is Dignitatis Humanae. It's the document of the Second Vatican Council on Human Dignity. Have you all seen this before? Yeah, pretty much everyone is. As you can see, there are a few red marks on this document as well. So this document right here is one of the most controversial documents of the Second Vatican Council. I often say that instead of Dignitatis Humanae, which means human dignity, it should be called Deificationis Humanae, human deification, because in reality, that's what it does. And we're going to see why here. This document also is commonly referred to as the document on religious liberty because it proposes that man possesses so much dignity that he has the freedom or the right to follow whatever religion he wants to. And it declares it in the following terms, quote, "The Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom." And a bit later, the Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation on the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right, close quote. Does that sound strange to anyone here? I hope so. I hope so, because this document claims that human dignity gives man a right to practice a false religion. Now, before we go on any further, I have to point out that there is a world of difference between saying that society should tolerate false religions and saying that society has to grant the right of man to practice a false religion. They're two very different things, and they lead to very different consequences. Rights, you see, are positive things that flow from God, who is the ultimate grantor of all rights. Thus, no one has a right to oppose God. There can be no such thing as a right to do wrong. Admittedly, society has to tolerate certain sins. I mean, it would be crazy to prosecute a schoolboy for lying to one of his friends. But it is unimaginable to say that he has this right, that there exists a right to lie, because society can't prosecute it. To say that man has a right to follow a false religion is to attribute that right to his human dignity is tantamount to saying that man's dignity gives him the right to deny God's right to be worshipped in the way that he asks us to worship him. You see that? That's why I call it human deification. Yes, ma'am?
It just seems like so much double talk, double think.
Big time.
Because the reality is God gave us all free will.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, we have the right to choose.
We have the
nobody talks about the consequences.
Yeah. We have the choice, but we don't have the right to choose wrongly. Because God has a right to be obeyed. And that right of God to be obeyed supersedes all rights. So he gives us the license. We have the choice, but we don't have the right to choose wrongly. I'm sorry that's very technical, but it's an important point, and we're going to see how it develops. But you're absolutely right. We get involved in all this double talk. But the distinctions are very important, because a little bit wrong distinction can lead to a huge bad problem at the end. Yes?
You barely touched on it. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the difference between a right and a license? Because I think that
yes. In fact, I can do that a little bit right now, but in fact, when I refute this and I get into Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Libertas, okay, I'm going to develop that a little bit further. Excellent. Is that all right?
Yes.
So just hold on. That's a very good question, and we're going to be dealing with it very, very shortly. So that's what's at play here. We're judging man's right against God's right, and this false vision of human dignity is saying man's rights supersede God's rights, which cannot be. That's to put man on an equal footing with God himself, or perhaps even put him above God. As I said, that's why this document should be called human deification. Now, however, the document goes even further. It claims that in the practice of any religion, man must, quote, enjoy immunity from external coercion as well as psychological freedom, close quote. So it's a violation of one's dignity if he feels psychologically forced or peer pressure to become a Catholic. It also says that false religions must be given free rein to proselytize and spread their errors, and that government is bound to show favor to the practice of any religion in order to promote common welfare. And I quote, "Government therefore ought indeed to take account of the religious life of the citizenry," talking about whatever religion they're following, "and show it favor, since the function of government is to make provision for the common welfare." Ladies and gentlemen, the suppression of error is one of the greatest ways that government can make provision for the common welfare. Now, a last point I'd like to mention is that Dignitatis Humanae also states that, quote, "Besides, the rights of parents are violated if their children are forced to attend lessons or instructions which are not in agreement with their religious beliefs," close quote. In other words, not only is society prohibited from fighting error, but it cannot insist that children are exposed to the truth. That's a very current issue because in Catholic countries, even the public schools throughout history have taught catechism, Catholic catechism. It's a normal practice. If they have public schools at all, and if education isn't taken on entirely by religious communities. This is saying if you have someone who's not Catholic in your society, you have to offer them an education that takes away catechism. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Now, as I said, so Dignitatis Humanae puts this up as a right and says that any violation of this is a violation of human dignity. Pope Leo XIII rejected this false notion of human dignity in his splendid encyclical titled Libertas, which is Latin for liberty. I cannot recommend this document enough for anyone who would like a deeper understanding of what human liberty truly is and how it is in direct opposition to the modern notion of liberty. What modern man understands as liberty is actually something else, which is called license, not liberty at all. License is the capacity to do whatever one wishes. True liberty is the freedom to act according to one's proper reason and nature. Thus, good laws, though they restrict behavior, safeguard true liberty because they defend the right of man to choose as he should. The philosophical explanation for why this is way beyond this talk. However, it has to be stated because this notion of license being opposed to liberty is fundamental to our notion of human dignity. As we mentioned, human dignity springs from the fact that we are made in God's image and likeness. And that image and likeness means that we share the faculties of reason and will with God. However, the existence of restrictions on the false use of our free will, in fact, give us an increase in true freedom, and therefore help us to increase our dignity. Now, I know that's very abstract. If you didn't follow it, don't worry about that because it's not essential to the understanding of this talk. But it will provide some background for the understanding of the sections of Libertas that I'm going to be quoting. And actually, a simple way of understanding this is just to say that true freedom gives us the right to do what we should, not simply what we want. Today, we are often restricted from doing what we should in the name of freedom. So paradoxically, the word freedom is actually being used to restrict our true freedom. Is that clear? Okay. Perhaps Madame Roland expressed it best at the foot of the guillotine, right before she was executed by the French Revolution, when she cried out, "O liberty, O freedom, how many crimes are committed in your name?" Close quote. And we see this at play in the document Dignitatis Humanae. It states, in the name of religious freedom, we have to put truth and error on an equal footing. And that prevents many from exercising true freedom in being able to choose the church, the Catholic faith, over other faiths. Now, Pope Leo XIII expressed this idea in the following words, quote, First, let us examine that liberty in individuals which is so opposed to the virtue of religion, namely the liberty of worship, freedom of religion, as it is called. This is based on the principle that every man is to profess as he may choose any religion or none, close quote. Now, after this, His Holiness affirms that man has the strictest obligation to worship God, first of all, and second of all, that the knowledge of the truth of the Catholic faith is within the grasp of all men. Thus, no man has an excuse not to practice the true religion, to practice a false religion. He stated, quote, "Wherefore, when a liberty such as we have described," here he's talking about religious liberty, when a religious liberty, is offered to man, the power is given him to pervert or abandon with impunity the most sacred of his duties, and to exchange the unexchangeable good for evil, which, as we have stated, this is no liberty, but it is degradation, and the abject submission of the soul to sin, close quote. Afterwards, he affirmed that not only are individuals obliged to acknowledge the Catholic religion, but governments are also required to accept the reality that the Catholic faith is the one true faith. Quote, "Civil societies must acknowledge God as its founder and parent, and must obey and revere his power and authority. Justice therefore forbids, and reason itself forbids, the state to be godless, or to adopt a line of action which would end in godlessness, namely to treat the various religions, as they call them, alike, and to bestow upon them promiscuously equal rights and privileges," close quote. Lastly, Pope Leo XIII links this necessity of the state to recognize the Catholic faith to the advancing of true liberty, saying this, quote, "We need not mention how greatly religion conduces to pure morals, and pure morals to liberty. Reason shows, and history confirms, the fact that the higher the morality of the states, the greater are the liberty and wealth and power which they enjoy," close quote. Well, ladies and gentlemen, after this long introduction, we can finally take a look at the encyclical Fratelli Tutti. The encyclical Fratelli Tutti is a call for fraternity and social friendship. This call to friendship is universal, knowing no borders, be they physical, racial, ideological, or religious. The only common thread upon which we are asked to build this fraternal union is the human dignity that we all share with every other man or woman on the planet. The problem is that when we look out upon humanity, we see that there is plenty that separates us in spite of this shared dignity. Pope Francis proposes that all of these differences can and must be superseded, not by missionary activity that would bring us in union around the true faith, but rather through two instruments which he repeatedly refers to but never clearly defines. The first tool that we use to overcome our differences is dialogue. And the second tool is what he calls encounter, encuentro in Spanish. Now, while dialogue has long been a catchphrase within progressive Catholic circles, this notion of encounter is something newer and promoted specifically by Pope Francis. You could even say that Pope Francis is the Pope of encounter, so much so that already in December of 2013, Vaticanist John Allen, who's already at the beginning of his papacy, said this, quote, "It is becoming steadily clear that for Francis, perhaps his core signature phrase is the culture of encounter," close quote. Now, a commonality between these two tools is that neither word, neither dialogue nor encounter, is easily defined. Their meaning is elastic enough to encompass a broad range of meanings. Thus, they are very dangerous words, especially when used in Catholic documents, church documents, where a difference in interpretation can be the difference between heresy and orthodoxy. Both words, however, are classic examples of what our founder, Dr. Plinio Correa de Oliveira, defined as talismanic words. In 1965, Dr. Plinio wrote an essay about the use of the talismanic word to change people from one ideological position to another without them even perceiving that they have changed. The essay is titled Unperceived Ideological Transshipment and Dialogue. And it uses the word dialogue to exemplify this process. And we don't have time to discuss this concept deeply, but the essay is available widely for free online for anyone who would like to look into it closer. The point to understand from this document here is that these words, these talismanic words, carry with them a certain charge. They sound sophisticated and are thus easily introduced into the common parlance of society. However, since their meaning is elastic, those who want to influence the population can slowly use the words in a context that is increasingly in line with the perspective they want the people to adopt. Since the people already use the words commonly and accept them as something positive, they continue to think of them in a good light as their understanding of the meaning of these words changes. Now, I know that's very difficult and abstract the way I described it. To explain it, let me use an example of a talismanic word that we have spoken a lot about during this talk, the word dignity. As we have seen, there are different meanings to the word dignity. In one respect, it can refer to an unchangeable honor that is owed to each man simply by the fact that he is made in the image and likeness of God. And according to this meaning, it leads to unalienable rights which every man possesses equally. However, under another meaning, it refers to an elastic quality that can be increased or decreased to a large extent by our actions, or even by the role that we fulfill in society. So say you all are good traditional Catholics who have a proper notion of human dignity, and I'm an evil man who wants to corrupt this notion in your mind and change your ideological perspective by using it as a talismanic word. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come to you and I'm going to bring the word dignity into your common vocabulary. I'm going to speak of it in very lofty terms and make sure that you become very attached to using this word dignity to the concept. After that, I will slowly start to change the meaning of the same word dignity by emphasizing the first meaning, man's intrinsic worth, as a creation of God, and at the same time I will de-emphasize the second meaning, which justifies that different people be treated differently. I might show you a video of a servant being mistreated by his employer and say, wow, that employer is committing a crime against the dignity of his servant. And it could actually be true. You probably accept it, as you should. However, I will continue to emphasize how one man's service to another can be abused, and when it is, it represents an attack on the servant's dignity. After you're accustomed to that, I'll start to discuss situations in which both servant and employer are at fault. Say the servant does something wrong and receives a punishment from the employer, but the punishment is excessive. I will say the servant shouldn't have done that, but the reaction of the employer is still an affront to the servant's dignity. And I can continue to do this over time in different cases in which the servant is increasingly at fault and the employer is increasingly less severe, but always repeating the mantra that the employer is acting against the servant's dignity. One day I will bring up a situation in which a servant receives an appropriate punishment for the offense he has committed and claim that his dignity has been offended. I might add something like, the servant was wrong, but what gives the employer the right to punish him? After all, they have the same dignity. Now, in one respect, this is true, but in another, it's not. They may possess the same intrinsic dignity, but from another perspective, the employer possesses more dignity as being in a position of leadership over the servant. Now, if you accept this new way that I'm using the word dignity, your understanding of what dignity is will be slightly changed, and worse yet, your ideological convictions about the role of leaders and followers in society will be slightly changed without you even realizing it. Is that clear? At a later stage, I can slowly manipulate the meaning of the word dignity until one day I will say, the world isn't right because although we all possess equal dignity, some have more possessions than others. Next, some people have more opportunities than others in spite of the fact that we all have equal dignity. If this goes on long enough, someday I will be able to convince you that man, because of his dignity, has a right to practice a false religion or even worship a false god. After all, In doing so, he doesn't lose any of his dignity as being made in God's image and likeness. So you see how this process works. It's one of the diabolically intelligent yet simple ways that the forces of evil corrupt mankind. Now, the good part about all this is that it is very easy to defeat the use of talismanic words. If you have to use them, define them clearly, define what they mean, and stick to that definition. Once there's clarity in definition, the talismanic word loses its charge and its ability to be changed. And that's why we went through the definition of dignity so strongly before we go any further. Is that clear to everyone? Excellent. Now, this is the process that Dr. Plino describes in Unperceived Ideological Transshipment and Dialogue. In it, he shows specifically how the word dialogue has been used to promote the goals of the revolution in society. Well, in Fratelli Tutti, the words dialogue, encounter, and dignity are all used as talismanic words, and they are used heavily throughout the document. I mentioned the document is 74 pages long. The term dialogue is used 49 times. Encounter is used 49 times. Dignity is used 66 times. It's almost once for every page in the document. So you can see how tricky this document is. It promotes universal brotherhood based on an exaggerated notion of human dignity and consigns the resolution of differences and disagreements that arise to the nebulous tools of encounter and dialogue. Now, with this background, we can now get into the real meat of the document. And to do this, I'm going to give you a short summary and quotes from each chapter. The document begins with an introduction in which the pontiff explains the purpose of the encyclical, which is to promote fraternity and social friendship. He refines the scope of the document, saying this, quote, "The following pages do not claim to offer a complete teaching on fraternal love, but rather to consider its universal scope, its openness to every man and woman," close quote. He adds, "It is my desire that in this our time, by acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity between all men and women," close quote. Then he finishes the introduction with these troubling words, quote, "It is my desire that in this our time, by acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity between all men and women." I'm sorry, we already quoted that. This is the part that I think is very, very concerning. "Let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travelers sharing the same faith, as children of the same earth, which is our common home. Each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions. Each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all," close quote. Now, just a brief commentary. I mean, this language is very foreign to pontifical documents. Popes have always referred to the people of God. They've addressed themselves to the people with some kind of religious terminology. Here, everyone is called fellow travelers of the same flesh, as children of the same earth. I'm sorry, I'm a child of my parents. Ultimately, I'm a child of Our Lady, our Lord. I'm not a child of the earth. Dirt didn't give birth to me. Maybe originally it did when God created man from the dirt, but that's something very, very different. Another thing that's troubling in this introduction is that religious syncretism is present from the very, very beginning. We just saw Pope Francis reference each of us bringing the richness of his or her own beliefs. He also claims that he felt, quote, particularly encouraged, close quote, to write the encyclical by the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib. So he's inspired by Islam to write this, or by an Islamic imam. So then we proceed to chapter 1, which is a description of, quote, certain trends in our world that hinder the development of universal brotherhood, close quote. Among these he mentions, quote, in some countries, a concept of popular and national unity influenced by various ideology is creating new forms of selfishness and a loss of the social sense under the guise of defending national interests, close quote. That is a very quaint way of condemning President Trump's America First policy. It is also the first blow he gives against national sovereignty. And this is a theme that he's going to repeat throughout the entire encyclical. Nevertheless, we would agree with some of the complaints that the Pope makes. For example, he decries the intemperate business practices that reduce the world to global markets in which people are seen as merely producers and consumers, stripping them of their value as individuals. I'm getting a little tongue-tied here. This is what's been dubbed commonly the Walmartization of the world. He complains about declining birth rates, which are leading to an aging population. However, we also start to see certain contradictions. He complains about the lack of a shared vision among humanity, yet he refuses to promote anything that could give humanity a shared vision. Above all else, any shared vision for the world has to come from the faith. And that requires the conversion of people. But Pope Francis, throughout the entire document, refuses to mention anywhere that notion of converting people. That's an affront to human dignity. Later, he complains about the COVID epidemic, but claims that it is a punishment from nature and the earth for man's misdeeds. Once again, this is very strange language coming from a pope. He says this, quote, "If everything is connected, it is hard to imagine that this global disaster is unrelated to our way of approaching reality, our claim to be the absolute masters of our lives and of all that exists, our environment. I do not want to speak of divine retribution, nor would it be sufficient to say that the harm we do to nature is in itself a punishment for our offenses. But the world itself is crying out in rebellion," close quote. So this pandemic is the earth, Mother Earth, crying out in rebellion against what we are doing as people. After this, he complains the lack of human dignity shown at the borders, as I'm sure you can imagine. This, he says, is troublesome because immigrants possess, quote, "the inalienable dignity each of human persons regardless of origin, race, or religion." As we've seen, all human beings do have these inalienable rights. But the privileges of full participation in society is obviously a very different question. I want to mention also his inclusion of religion there. Immigrants need to be welcomed in spite of religion. That is directly addressing the problem in Europe, where Muslims are invading France and England and literally taking those countries over. So I'm sorry, did someone have a... Okay. So that's what he's referring to there. So that's kind of a summary of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, in Chapter 2, he recounts and discusses the parable of the Good Samaritan. Particularly concerning here is Pope Francis's claim that, quote, "Jesus' parable summons us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of our respective nations and of the entire world, builders of a new social bond," close quote. This notion of everyone being citizens of the world is very troublesome. Repeatedly, Pope Francis uses this type of language. He even calls for a worldwide governing body, a type of one world government. I mean, this is really New World Order and Great Reset kind of stuff. Alex Jones would have a field day with this encyclical. And I must say he wouldn't be entirely wrong either to do so. Now, another very odd passage in this chapter states this, quote, remember, we're talking about the parable of the Samaritan. "The Samaritans lived in a region where pagan rites were practiced. For the Jews, this made them impure, detestable, and dangerous. In fact, one ancient Jewish text referred to nations that were hated, referring to nations that were hated, speaks of Samaria as not even a people. It also refers to the foolish people that live in Shechem." Now you might ask, what is this one ancient Jewish text that the Pope is quoting, and why is he quoting it? Well, the book that he's referring to is the book of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, in the Catholic Bible. In other words, the Vicar of Christ on earth refers to the revealed Word of God as one ancient Jewish text. It's a little bit strange, wouldn't you agree? Well, continuing on, Chapter 3 is entitled Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. And here the Pope further develops his ideas of universal brotherhood. He pushes a limp-wristed view of charity in which everyone is accepted as they are and welcomed into full communion with everyone else. Now, along these same lines, he states, quote, "Love, then, is more than just a series of benevolent actions. Those actions have their source in a union increasingly directed towards others, considering them of value, worthy, pleasing, and beautiful apart from their physical and moral appearances. Our love for others, for who they are, moves us to seek the best for their lives. Only by cultivating this way of relating to one another, we made possible social friendship that excludes no one and a fraternity that is open to all." Close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, this contradicts church teaching that states that sin has to be surrounded with social stigma. It's the only way our instinct of sociability, peer pressure, can act in a positive way when sin is rejected. That's why we as Catholics are forbidden from even entering the house of a couple who's in an irregular marital situation. However, once we have accepted the false notion of human dignity and believe that people have the right to live however they please, regardless of God's law, we lose the foundation upon which we may stand to exclude certain types of sinners from our social circles and friendships. Is that clear? Okay. Well, this chapter also contains what I consider to be, at least symbolically, the worst part of the encyclical. Pope Francis titled one of the sections of this chapter, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." This, of course, was the rallying call of the French Revolution, which was one of the most anti-Catholic movements in all of history. Not only did the French Revolution martyr thousands of Catholics of all rank and reject the church outright, but it also killed the aristocratic elements of civil society. For me, this represents the head of the Catholic Church officially joining with and cheering on the revolutionary process. It's something that's simply unimaginable. Now, in this chapter, Pope Francis also begins to speak in terms of the injustice that exists, because some people are born in areas with less resources than other areas. This is important because he will later develop this idea and claim that rich countries have the obligation to ensure that poor nations have the same conditions as theirs. In other words, international redistribution of wealth. And this is simply the application of Marxist class struggle to countries instead of social classes. Our founder, Dr. Plino, foresaw this exact maneuver in 1992 when he updated the third part of his book, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. Anyway, we see the seed of this idea in the following quote. Quote, "If each individual is of such great worth, it must be stated clearly and firmly that the mere fact that some people are born in places with fewer resources or less development does not justify the fact that they were living with less dignity." Close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, the conditions into which a man is born are determined by God, and they're in no way unjust. Furthermore, there's no way to equalize this. It has to be accepted, and the individual is duty-bound to be gracious to God for the conditions into which he's born and live with as much dignity as those conditions permit. Now, this next paragraph, Pope Francis doubles down on this idea, claiming that everyone has the right to, quote-unquote, live in dignity, regardless of whether or not they are productive. He states, quote, "Every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally. This fundamental right cannot be denied to any country, by any country. People have this right even if they are unproductive or are born with developmental limitations." That part we'd agree with. "This does not detract from their great dignity as human persons, a dignity based not on circumstances but on the intrinsic worth of their being. Unless this basic principle is upheld, there will be no future either for fraternity nor for the survival of humanity." Close quote. I believe that's called fear-mongering. I mean, is the survival of humanity really at stake because some people are born in countries that have less opportunities than others? But not only that, his assertion that everyone has a right to live in dignity, whether they are productive or not, is very nebulous. Does this mean they have to be afforded their inalienable rights? Well, of course they do. But does it mean that those unwilling to work should be given handouts? so that they can live in the same dignity as somebody that works? If that's what he means by it, he's contradicting St. Paul, who stated in his second epistle to the Thessalonians this, quote, "For also when we were with you, this we declared to you, that if a man will not work, neither let him eat." Close quote. Very different terminology. St. Paul had a different notion, again, of human dignity than some people do today. Now, this chapter also contains a denial of the right of private property, a right so holy, so sacred, that it's enshrined in 2 of the 10 commandments. The 7th commandment says you can't steal from someone else, and the 10th commandment says you can't even covet what someone else has. Now, in opposition to this, Pope Francis states this, quote, "For my part, I would observe that the Christian tradition has never recognized the right of private property as absolute or inviolable, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. The principle of the common use of created goods, listen, is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. It is a natural and inherent right which takes priority over all of the others." Close quote. I mean, with all due respect to His Holiness, this is utter madness. First of all, to say that the Church never considered the right of private property inviolable, Karl Marx said his whole theory of communism could be reduced to the abolition of the right of private property. Second of all, to state that the common use of created goods is a right that takes precedence over all others doesn't make any sense at all. How does that take precedence over the right to life, for example? It's really, really, really strange to see. As we read further, we see that Pope Francis is truly proposing the institution of a worldwide socialist regime. In the following quote, His Holiness's arguments cannot be seen as anything than a justification for land reform. He says this, quote, "No one then can remain excluded because of his or her place of birth, much less because of the privileges enjoyed by others who were born in lands of greater opportunity. The limits and borders of individual states cannot stand in the way of this, as it is unacceptable that some have fewer rights by virtue of being women. It is likewise unacceptable that the mere place of one's birth or residence should result in his or her possessing fewer opportunities for a developed and dignified life." Close quote. So if you're born with more opportunities than I am, be it because you live on a different piece of land or in a different country, that goes against my dignity. How do you correct that? You take from some and you give to the other. That's the only thing. And notice he talks about the limits of borders on individual states can't stand in the way of this. This is a global socialist regime he's talking about here. And just in case anyone would doubt how Marxist his intentions are, he also argues this, quote, "The right of some to free enterprise or market freedom cannot supersede the rights of peoples and the dignity of the poor, or for that matter, respect for the natural environment. For if we make something our own, it is only to administer it for the good of all." Close quote. I think that speaks for itself. Well, moving on, chapter 4 is titled, "A Heart Open to All." And in it, the Pope begins to leave the theoretical realm and give concrete examples of what his plan is going to look like. Now, as I have mentioned, he argues in favor of a global government to enact the changes that he desires. And in this chapter, he states this explicitly. For example, he says this, quote, "Since the consequences of the decisions made by each inevitably have repercussions on the entire international community, our response can only be the fruit of a common effort to develop a form of global governance with regard to the movements of migration. Thus, there is a need for a midterm and long-term planning which is not limited to emergency responses. Such planning should include effective assistance for integrating migrants into their receiving countries, while also promoting the development of their countries of origin through policies inspired by solidarity, yet not linking this assistance to ideological strategies and practices alien or contrary to the cultures of the people being assisted." Close quote. So this global body is going to have the authority not just over the movement of peoples from one country to another, but also would be responsible for ensuring that goods of richer countries end up in the hands of the poorer countries. And no country can ask anything back, can't expect any kind of ideological change or religious change. For example, if we help the people in the Middle East, we're violating their dignity if we demand that they give freedom to Catholics in the Middle East. That's what he's saying here, plainly and simply. Anyway, let's move on. I'm going to start getting angry, and that's not going to be good. So his ideas of the relationship between people doesn't end with redistribution of wealth, but even enters into the realm of sharing ideology and religious ideas. He calls for the West to learn from the so-called anti-materialistic values of Muslim countries. He said, quote, "On an even broader scale, Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib and I have observed that good relations between East and West are indisputably necessary for both. They must not be neglected so that each can be enriched by the other's culture through fruitful exchanges and dialogue. The West can discover in the East remedies for those spiritual and religious maladies that are caused by prevailing materialism," close quote. I don't want to become a servant of an imam in a Muslim country to crush out my materialism. I think there are better ways to do it. Also, you talk about materialism. The leaders of these Muslim nations, many times the leader will own over 90% of the wealth of the whole nation. That's not materialistic. That's their idol. I mean, come on, it just gets silly at a certain point. So throughout this chapter, Pope Francis continues to argue in favor of a more globalized world. He stresses the need for all peoples to enrich their cultures by embracing elements from all other cultures. When this happens, he argues, the result is a new synthesis that is ultimately beneficial to all, since the original culture itself ends up being nourished. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this idea of a new synthesis that comes from the meeting of peoples is pure Marxist dialectic. It's the notion of first exists a thesis, then an antithesis comes to conquer it, and the result is a new synthesis. That's the Marxist understanding of the evolving of society. So with this idea, we have to accept, for example, when we encounter savage nations, the savage indigenous culture, so-called culture, has to somehow affect our Catholic way of being. We enrich our Catholic way of being by accepting some of that. You can see in this a justification for the worship of the Pachamama idol that took place during the last synod. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. Now he continues along the same line, saying this, quote, "Each particular group becomes part of the fabric of universal communion and there discovers its own beauty. All individuals, whatever their origin, know that they are part of a greater human family, without which they will not be able to understand themselves fully." In other words, we can only understand ourselves fully when we converge with all other peoples into this universal communion with them. This is a modern expression of the ancient heresy of Gnosticism, plainly and simply. It's perfectly in line with the condemned teachings of a man named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Anyone ever heard of Chardin before? That was very much in line with his teaching. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. Well, we continue with chapter 5. This one's titled A Different Kind of Politics. There are only 8 chapters, so we are reaching the end here. I know it's been a long talk, but we're getting there. So, a better kind of politics. In this chapter, Pope Francis argues for the emergence of a new politics that's based on and nourished by love. He says that politics must take on a strange, mystical, tribalistic flavor. In another indirect condemnation of Trump, he says this. He says that politics have to become more popular and less populist, because Trump styles himself a populist. Now, of course, his use of the term popular here also comes from the socialist Latin American popular movements, if you've heard of that, the popular movements. To give you an idea of what this looks like, popular, he says, comes from the people. And I quote, "People is not a logical category, nor is it a mystical category, if by that we mean that everything the people does is good, or that the people are an angelic reality. Rather, people is a mythic category. When you have to explain what you mean by people, you use logical categories for the sake of explanation, and necessarily so. Yet in that way, you cannot explain what it means to belong to a people. Close quote. So throw logic out the door, first of all, because you can't. But furthermore, this mythical character is a reference to what postmodern writers refer to when they explain the role of storytelling in governance. I don't know if you all read Wacky Liberals, but they're always referring to this, the storytelling. It has its origin in the indigenous tribal chieftains who would inspire their people with mythical stories. And Pope Francis continues along these lines. He says this, quote, popular leaders, now remember, there's no way to logically define what peoples are or what they're thinking. Popular leaders, those capable of interpreting the feelings and cultural dynamics of a people without logic, and significant trends in society do exist, close quote. Now, I admit there's some truth in this idea. Any true leader must be capable of interpreting trends in society. They have to be in touch with the feelings and culture of the people. The problem I have with this is, first of all, it's entirely secular. There's no mention of grace, of bringing people along the way of God, none of that. And in fact, the whole encyclical is written from a secular perspective, in which Mother Earth takes the place of God. But beyond that, in describing these leaders who have this capacity of interpreting feelings and cultural dynamics, which he has stated cannot be explained with logic, and then on top of that, he secularizes these leaders by not in any way linking them to anything spiritual or supernatural. The image I get when thinking about this is a cultish guru with strange powers, especially when we consider the context of the mythical that he's placing this whole thing in. I don't know, it's very strange, and I think it's very much a call to that indigenous tribal thing that Pope Francis liked so much, that was the Amazon Synod, get in touch with the indigenous tribal peoples. Well, moving along, the political power he describes in this chapter is one entirely in line with the Marxist dialectic that we mentioned previously. So he states, quote, a living and dynamic people with a future is one constantly open to new synthesis through its ability to welcome differences, close quote. You can really see how secular the encyclical is here. The progress of a people consists in them increasingly molding themselves in conformity with the absolute truth that God has revealed to mankind, not absorbing the differences for the sake of arbitrary change. And that is the profound fallacy I find in that idea of thesis plus antithesis equals synthesis. It's not guided by God, it's not guided by anything, it's arbitrary. And it's very pagan. Now, to accomplish this international convergence that he calls for, he argues once again for the establishment of worldwide governing bodies. He complains about the individualistic welfare solutions that are often proposed. He argues that when these benefits require the recipient to do something or act in a certain way, it leaves the majority behind. And then he says this, quote, this demonstrates the need for a greater spirit of fraternity, but also a more efficient worldwide organization to help resolve the problems plaguing the abandoned who are suffering and dying in poor countries, close quote. This government would be tasked with overcoming inequalities between men rather than by allowing some men to succeed, become great, and then uplift all of society to a higher plane. He argues directly against this idea. In this way, Pope Francis argues against the notion of trickle-down economics, which, among others, President Reagan did work. You're all familiar with the concept. When the rich get richer, they can hire more employees. All of society goes up together with this. However, that's not what Pope Francis wants. He says this, quote, neoliberalism simply reproduces itself by resorting to the magic theories of spillover or trickle, without using the name, as the only solution to societal problems. There is little appreciation of the fact that the alleged spillover does not resolve the inequality that gives rise to new forms of violence threatening the fabric of society. So for him, it's that inequality, not the poverty, that has to be overcome. It's that some men have more than others, because inequality necessarily breeds violence. what he just stated. Now, in order to accomplish this, he argues once again for an international governing body that has real authority. He says, quote, "The 21st century is witnessing a weakening of the power of nation states, chiefly because the economic and financial sectors, being transnational, tend to prevail over the political. Given this system, it is essential to devise stronger and more efficiently organized international institutions, with functionaries who are appointed fairly by agreement among national governments and empowered to impose sanctions." Close quote. So he desires this international government to possess real power, to have teeth. They can impose sanctions on nations. And it would be global sanctions from that perspective as well. Now, in this chapter, Pope Francis also affirms that to achieve his goal of global convergence, we have to give ultimate priority to the false idea of human dignity. He says this, quote, "At a time when various forms of fundamentalist intolerance are damaging relationships between individuals," he's talking about us there, fundamentalists, people who resort to fundamental ideas, destroying relationships between individuals, groups, and people, let us be committed to living and teaching the value of respect for others, a love capable of welcoming differences, and the priority of the dignity of every human being over his or her ideas, opinions, practices, and even over his sins, close quote. So there you have it. Universal brotherhood demands that in the name of man's dignity, we welcome all men regardless of their sinfulness. Moving on to chapter 6. Chapter 6 is titled Dialogue and Friendship in Society. This chapter is based entirely on two of the talismanic words we discussed before. Thus, the first two sentences of this chapter state this, quote, "Approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, coming to know and understand one another, and to find common ground. All these things are summed up in the one word dialogue. If we want to encounter and help one another, we have to dialogue." Now you can also in this chapter, you get a very you can sense how utopian Pope Francis's ideas are. For example, he says this, quote, "Some people attempt to flee from reality, taking refuge in their own little world. Others react to it with destructive violence. Yet, between selfish indifference and violent protest, there is always another option possible, that of dialogue." So in other words, all of you who are hiding from the violence in the streets, and those of you of BLM and Antifa who are burning our streets to the ground, to resolve your problems, you just need to get together and dialogue. Pure utopia. Now, this chapter is almost entirely a repetition of what's been said in previous chapters, but adding that all of our problems will be solved if we dialogue and encounter all people. However, it would seem that this notion of dialogue is rather one-sided. So much so, he makes excuses for those who have recourse to violence in order to promote revolutionary change. He says this, quote, "When one part of society exploits all the world has to offer, acting as if the poor did not exist, there will eventually be consequences. Sooner or later, ignoring the existence and rights of others will erupt in some form of violence, often when it is least expected. Liberty, equality, and fraternity," again, French Revolution, "liberty, equality, and fraternity can remain lofty ideals unless they apply to everyone. Encounter cannot take place only between the holders of economic, political, or academic power," close quote. So with another nod to the French Revolution, the Pope claims that when the world lacks liberty, equality, and fraternity, it is natural that violence will erupt. Furthermore, we have to grant these three values to absolutely everyone. Thus he says this, quote, "A realistic and inclusive social covenant must be a cultural covenant, one that respects and acknowledges the different worldviews, cultures, and lifestyles that coexist in society." We all know what he means by lifestyles here. Ladies and gentlemen, the sin of homosexuality is a sin that spreads like wildfire in a society that refuses to resist it. And that's why I affirm we should never enter into a social covenant with practicing homosexuals, period. I mean, does that make me weird? For 2,000 years, Catholics always and everywhere would not have thought so. Now, he also calls upon all people to be kind. Kindness is going to resolve everything. Thus, we must make a point of never offending others by word or deed. And a kind word, or even giving someone a smile, will resolve all of our differences. He says this, quote, "Often nowadays, we find neither the time nor the energy to stop and to be kind to others, to say, 'Excuse me, pardon me, thank you.' Yet every now and then, miraculously, a kind person appears and is willing to set everything else aside in order to show interest, to give the gift of a smile, to speak a word of encouragement, to listen amid general indifference. If we make a daily effort to do exactly this, we can create a healthy social atmosphere in which misunderstandings can be overcome and conflict forestalled." Close quote. How many of you have ever seen the campaign videos of TFP Student Action? Pretty much everyone has. Well, you'll understand me then when I say this, and every TFP member can attest to it. When you are dealing directly with a public that is purely revolutionary, when you are surrounded by a gaggle of pro-homosexuals who are screaming in your face about all the indecent things they'd like to do to you, a smile or a kind word will accomplish absolutely nothing. And that's the reality of the evil that exists in our society. I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's the way it is. Kindness is not enough. Well, chapter 7, moving along, is similar to chapter 6, but instead of emphasizing the word dialogue, it emphasizes the necessity of encounter. So now we don't have to dialogue with evil elements in society. We just need to encounter them. And again, there's a lot of utopian ideas. There's a lot of repetition in this section. Unfortunately, Pope Francis attempts to bring our Lord himself into debate on his side. Thus he says, quote, "Jesus never promoted violence or intolerance," close quote. Our Lord certainly never tolerated the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. He called them brood of vipers. He called them whitewashed sepulchres. And as far as violence is concerned, even today's media would find it difficult to say that he whipped the money changers in the temple during a mostly peaceful protest. Pope Francis also denies that any form of revenge or retaliation is ever acceptable. He claims that we must always forgive everyone, even if they are not repentant. And I quote, "If forgiveness is gratuitous, it can be shown even to someone who resists repentance and is unable to beg pardon. And yet, we can't expect others to forgive." And I quote, "Of those who have endured much unjust and cruel suffering, a sort of social forgiveness must not be demanded from them." Close quote. So this idea of encounter, just like dialogue, seems a little bit one-sided to me. This chapter also contains an absolute condemnation of war under any and all circumstances, as well as an absolute condemnation of the death penalty. And surprisingly, one of the main reasons he cites for being against war is because war does harm to the environment. Now, in his condemnation of war, he even admits that the church has always taught that just war is morally correct. He says this, quote, "We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in early centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. I say, never again war," close quote. So yeah, the church has always taught that wars can be just, but never again, never again. He quotes John the 23rd as having said something similar, quote, "It no longer makes sense to maintain that war is a fit instrument with which to repair the violation of justice," close quote. Pope Francis continues saying this, quote, "Every war leaves our world worse off than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Let us not remain mired in a theoretical discussion, but touch the wounded flesh of war's victims," close quote. Well, every war leaves our world worse off than it was before. Is he saying that it would have been better if Hitler had been allowed to conquer the whole world? What about the wars to contain communism? What about the wounded flesh of more than 100 million people slaughtered by communist regimes around the world? What about wars to contain the Muslim threat? And I'm not even referring to the Crusades here. Those were also preached and defended by countless saints, including St. Francis of Assisi and St. Bernard. But I'm talking about the Battle of Lepanto and the Siege of Vienna. Both of these were fought to repel Muslim forces at the very point at which they were entering Europe with the goal of marching on Rome and extinguishing the church forever. If Catholic forces had not stopped them with war, would the world have been better afterwards? Similarly to this, he calls for the absolute worldwide abolition of the death penalty. He says, quote, "Today we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible and the church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide," close quote. To buttress his opinion, he takes a quote of St. Augustine out of context. He takes a quote of St. Augustine referring to a single case where St. Augustine wanted to spare someone who was being condemned to death. In spite of the fact that St. Augustine, throughout his life, not only strenuously defended the death penalty, but he was the one who first developed the just war theory of the church. So he was in favor of just war and the death penalty. And as if this weren't bad enough, he calls for the abolition of life sentences as well. Thus he says, quote, "All Christians and people of goodwill are today called to work not only for the abolition of the death penalty, legal or illegal, in all of its forms, but also work for the improvement of prison conditions out of respect for the human dignity of persons deprived of their freedom." I would link this to life imprisonment. A life sentence is a secret death penalty, close quote. Again, he states, quote, "The firm rejection of the death penalty shows to what extent it is possible to recognize the inalienable dignity of every human being and to accept he or she has a place in the universe. If I do not deny that dignity to the worst of criminals, I will not deny it to anyone. I will give everyone the possibility of sharing this planet with me, despite all of our differences," close quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know that this whole death penalty thing has been a contentious issue since the seamless garment doctrine of Cardinal Bernardin in the 80s. However, the legitimacy of the death penalty has been considered settled doctrine since the very beginning of the church. In fact, it's reaffirmed repeatedly in the scriptures. If you will recall, while our Lord hung on the cross and the bad thief mocked him, St. Dismas came to our Lord's defense, saying this, quote, neither dost thou fear God, seeing thou art condemned to death, and we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds, but this man has done no evil." In other words, the good thief proclaimed the legitimacy of the death penalty in the presence of the God-man at the very moment of his conversion. Our Lord's response was unequivocally positive. He passed sentence on this idea by instantly sanctifying St. Dismas, telling him, "Amen, I say to thee, this day thou shalt be with me in paradise." Close quote. Well, for this and other reasons, church teaching on the legitimacy of the death penalty has been considered so integral to Catholic doctrine that Pope Innocent III actually required that the Waldensian heretics affirm their acceptance of the death penalty as being legitimate in order to allow them to readmission into the Catholic Church. So he would not let them rejoin the body of the faithful unless they proclaimed that they agreed with the death penalty. Well, we're finally reaching the end here. The 8th and final chapter is titled Religions at the Service of Fraternity in Our World. And it preaches a form of ecumenism that I cannot imagine is not heretical. Now, in saying this, I have to admit that I'm not an expert on these things. But nevertheless, Pope Francis states, quote, "Dialogue between the followers of different religions does not take place simply for the sake of diplomacy, consideration, or tolerance. In the words of the Bishop of India, the goal of dialogue is to establish friendship, peace, and harmony, and to share the spiritual and moral values and experiences in a spirit of truth and love." Close quote. Like I said, I'm not an expert, but I don't think a Catholic, and above all a Pope, can extol dialogue with leaders of false religions in this way. We do not share a spiritual and moral values with members of false religions, and certainly not in a spirit of truth. Any aspect of the truth that any other religion possesses exists entirely within the church. Thus, the church gains nothing by exposure to the spirituality or morality of other religions. This is a very serious issue. The chapter continues promoting the sanctity of religious freedom. It justifies this again by reaffirming the false notion of human dignity, and also by speaking of the esteem the church has for the ways in which God works in other religions, close quote. Now, in the very last section of the encyclical, the Pope decries any form of violence for religious motives. This denies the right of the church to defend the truth with force when it is necessary. He claims this is true because, quote, God does not see with his eyes, God sees with his heart. And God's love is the same for everyone, regardless of religion. Even if they are atheists, his love is the same, close quote. Yeah, I don't accept that. Plainly and simply, I don't accept that God loves atheists as much as faithful Catholics. He finishes with an appeal to all religions, saying this, quote, in my fraternal meeting, which I gladly recall with the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib, we resolutely declared that religions must never incite war, hateful attitudes, hostility, and extremism, nor must they incite violence or the shedding of blood. These tragic realities are the consequence of a deviation from religious teachings. They result from a political manipulation of religions and from interpretations made by religious groups who, in the course of history, have taken advantage of the powers of religious sentiment in the hearts of men and women. God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone and does not want his name used to terrorize people, close quote. So in one fell swoop, he denies the virtue of all the holy religious warriors throughout history. And also, I can't help but sense a touch of cynicism in his holiness's affirmation that God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone. Now, obviously, everyone knows that God cannot be harmed by anything or by anyone. Of course, he doesn't depend on his creatures for his defense, but that's not the point here. When man properly loves God, he will fight to maintain God's honor before his fellow men and fight to ensure that the truth of revelation that God brought to the earth, that the Son of Man suffered and died to bring to the world, can be freely transmitted to everyone. Now, before we move on to the conclusion, does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you find it curious the way that he refers to the Grand
Imam?
Does Pope Francis view them as equals?
That's a good question.
That's definitely what appears to be coming across. And
very much
one
so.
is supposed to be the vicar of Christ on earth, and the other one is the leader of a false religion.
Yeah, and you know, there's some consistency in that, because he says that he was inspired to write this encyclical by the Grand Imam. The last, Laudato Si', he was inspired by that patriarch, the super liberal Orthodox patriarch, I forget his name, the one that recently said that the Orthodox Church has no problem with abortion under certain circumstances. So yeah, it's consistent, and that's very troublesome. But again, I think that's, this notion of false dignity. We're all equal. We have equal dignity. So I know that this has been a very long meeting, and one that has dealt with difficult concepts. So I know that I have greatly tired you all out. And that's why my conclusion is going to be very short. First, I would like to point out that in criticizing this encyclical, I do not intend to criticize the legitimate desire for union between nations. This is a high ideal, and every pope should work towards its attainment. However, for this union to exist, it has to be grounded in mutual respect for the truth. The Catholic Church is the only institution capable of forging such an institution among the nations in a legitimate way. And that's because the Church, in its universality, is made for all men. Thus, every race, ethnicity, and culture finds itself at home within the Catholic Church. That's why Catholicism has often been compared to salt. Our Lord told the apostles, "You are the salt of the earth." Among all the spices of the world, salt has the unique quality whereby it brings out the true flavor in food. It doesn't cover up that natural flavor, it brings it out. And after bringing it out, it preserves that food and that flavor from corruption. That is what Catholicism does for all people. It brings out their true uniqueness. It accentuates everything that is best about them without suppressing who they are, and it protects them from corruption. Only the Catholic Church can do this. In the wake of World War II, there was a lot of talk about forging an association of state leaders to maintain peace throughout Europe. And this was in no way a bad idea. But at the time, I believe it was in 1947, Dr. Pino wrote an article in which he stated that he would support the formation of such an international organization as long as it was founded upon the Catholic Church. If not, he warned, any international group would become, quote, a nation-devouring hydra. You know what a hydra is. It's that seven-headed snake. And this is exactly what we've seen with secular attempts to create such unions. Consider the European Union. Rather than uniting Europe, it has choked it out with regulations on how the French make their cheese, how the Germans make their beer, and how all Europeans assert their nationality and those things that are most unique to each one of them. So we should all pray for a future unity among all nations that is founded, as was Christendom, upon the truths of the faith. Such a union would uplift mankind under the mantle of Mary Most Holy. At the same time, we must reject the secular, communist, nation-devouring hydra being proposed by Pope Francis that would further impoverish mankind spiritually and usher in false convergence and a relativistic new world order to the detriment of absolutely everyone. Thank you very much.